there's just so much.
You're listening to a Mamamia podcast.
Mamamia acknowledges the traditional owners of land and waters this podcast was recorded on.
It's a Tuesday evening on the 24th of September 2024 in the American state of Missouri, and Marcellus Williams is preparing to die. He's been sentenced to death by lethal injection for the stabbing murder of Felecia Gayle, a local reporter who was found dead in her home in 1998. Williams has been on death row since 2001, but doubt has been cast over his guilt. A lot of doubt. The 55-year-old's lawyers, the victim's family, the prosecution and the jurors who convicted him have all admitted he may not be guilty. But those in charge aren't listening. The governor has denied appeals. The Supreme Court hasn't intervened. And so here we are. Williams has consumed his final meal of choice, chicken wings and tater tots, and said his final words.
Praise be to Allah in every
All
situation.
praise be to Allah in every situation. He is pronounced dead at exactly 6:10 p.m. But what does the evidence show? Should Williams have been spared? Did Missouri just execute an innocent man? I'm Gemma Barth, and this is True Crime Conversations, a Mamamia podcast exploring the world's most notorious crimes by speaking to the people who know the most about them. Marcellus Williams was the 100th person executed in Missouri since 1989. Officials from the Missouri Department of Corrections addressed the media after his death.
We hope this gives finality to a case that has languished for decades, re-victimizing Miss Gayle's family over and over again. No juror nor judge has ever found Williams' innocence claim to be credible. Thus, the order of execution has been carried out.
What this press conference fails to address is the mounting evidence that suggested that Williams' case wasn't as watertight as this statement by Governor Mike Parson made it sound. Even if Williams was guilty, what those fighting to save his life insisted was there was reasonable doubt in this conviction. That alone should have saved his life. 3 months before his execution, host and creator of the true crime podcast 1 Minute Remaining, Jack Laurence, spoke to Williams on the phone from prison.
There's obviously people in the community who would, listen to your story, and people would turn around and say, oh, well, this guy was a career criminal. He was in and out of prison. Why should we trust what he says?
Right. My response would be, if you believe in democracy and you believe in the justice system that's set up in this country, then you understand that the rule of law is supposed to govern. Irregardless of whatever I was going through, those choices that I made in those other cases has absolutely nothing to do with this case here. Everything is supposed to be judged in the light in which they come and being presented to people.
After speaking to Williams and getting to know him, Jack also joined the fight to save his life. Jack joins us now. Jack, how did you find yourself chatting to Marcellus Williams from prison mere months before his execution?
So I was on LinkedIn as you are, sort of scrolling through. I follow the Innocence Project on LinkedIn, obviously because of the sort of work I now do. And they put up a post about Marcellus Williams and the fact that, it was a bit of a call to action to try and help him. Because for those who don't know, the Innocence Project in the United States works with people that they believe who have been wrongfully convicted, and they work to try and help them become exonerated. And he was one of their clients, and they put a post up about him, and I sort of did a bit of looking into his story. And then I reached out to him, as I do with most of the men and women who I find who are incarcerated, sent him a message. I wasn't sure how it was going to go because I've tried to talk to people on death row before, and they're under a far more stricter rules than sort of regularly people who are incarcerated. So I wasn't sure how I was going to go, and I've never actually spoken to someone who'd been given their date. Like I've reached out to people who are on death row because people spend many years on death row prior to actually be given their date.
Well, decades even.
Yeah. I mean, some people even die on death row of old age before they even get to the death sentence. So he was the first person I'd come across who actually been given his date. So I sent him a message and sort of introduced myself and told him what I do, and I would love to talk to him. And he said, yeah, happy to talk to you. I will give you a call. And again, I wasn't sure how that worked because most of the people I speak to, they use the sort of phones in the rec room. They'll have, phones in there and they call me from there. So I knew he wouldn't be in that situation. I knew he would be in his cell. So I wasn't sure whether they'd take him out of his cell to use a phone. But anyway, long story short, he calls me. I said, "Oh, so how are we speaking at the moment?" He said, "Oh, whenever someone gets given their date, as in, this is your final date, this will be your execution," which for him was for 3 months' time. One of the so-called privileges they get, I guess, is as a phone permanently in their room, which they're allowed to use to call loved ones, I suppose, attorneys. So he literally had a phone within his cell, and he was essentially confined to his cell, and that was it. And I said to him, like, "Are you the only person on the row, as they call it at the moment?" He goes, No, there's a guy next to me, Mr. Hauser. He said he's got his date actually for next Tuesday.
Oh, wow.
And it was a real sobering thing that his next door neighbor was up for his date the following Tuesday, and this Mr. Hauser gentleman was killed the following Tuesday. So that's basically how it all came about.
Well, it really would be a privilege then having that phone when you're so alone and all of a sudden you've got this lifeline to the outside world that you can use, I'm assuming, whenever you want.
Yeah, I believe it was a case of using whenever you want, because people are incarcerated. They do have access to phones, but there's obviously a time period where they have access to those phones. They're switched on and switched off. They can't use them during what they call count times. Obviously, they go around and make sure everybody is there, and no one's decided to leave the prison a certain amount of time. Some facilities give them 15 minutes to talk, and then it just cuts them off. Some are 30 minutes, others are 10 minutes, and then they have to wait that allotted time again before they can use the phone again to stop people obviously using the phones. There's other people I talk to incarcerated who can't use the phones because gangs control the phones.
Oh. So
the fact he had his own phone, was essentially, it was a privilege, but I mean, that privilege came with the fact that he was going to die in 3 months. So, it's a odd privilege, shall we say.
Yeah, of course. How many conversations did you have with him, and what kind of rapport did you build with this man?
Actually, far less of a rapport with him than most of the men and women I speak to, purely because of the situation he was in. We only spoke on the phone once. I did try and get back on the phone with him again, but he obviously had bigger fish to fry than speaking to some podcast bloke in Australia. But we did have a lot of messages backward and forward by sort of email. That he had access to a tablet where he could send out email via the prison mailing system. So we had some messages backward and forward. Conversations, but I find my conversations with people incarcerated very difficult, knowing the right thing to say and what you don't want to say the wrong thing, and it was even harder with a man who was in his position, because of what do you say to a man who's literally been told you're going to die on this date at this time. But we had some back and forth. I really enjoyed my conversation with him on the phone. He was a very articulate man. Seemed like a very nice man. I mean, was no choir boy. He had an extensive record, and he openly admits to that. So I'm not trying to sit here go, play the violin sort of thing. He did the wrong thing a lot of times in his past. I'm not sure about the one he was killed for. I certainly don't believe he should have been killed for it. But yeah, I enjoyed our conversation, like I do with most of the people I speak to who are incarcerated. Who I enjoy my conversations with these people because they're deep thinkers a lot of the time, and he was a deep thinker.
Well, as you've alluded to, you speak to so many men and women in prison, some of them on death row, and a lot of them telling you that they're innocent. Have you started to kind of be able to tell if they're telling the truth, or if you believe that they're telling the truth?
Yeah, it's funny you should ask that, because actually one of my recent episodes I covered this, because I do get a lot of people telling me that they're innocent, and so many people say to me, "Oh, you can't believe them all," and of course I don't believe all of them. I don't think I've got the answer to who is truly innocent and who is guilty, because obviously I talk to a lot of people who say they're innocent. I believe a number of them. I wholeheartedly believe a number of them, but I sort of found this sort of tell with people who I think are more genuine, should I say, as opposed to absolutely innocent, but more genuine, and that is their empathy. Because the way I see it, a lot of the people I'm talking to have been committed for the crime of murder. And that to me is a very selfish act in itself.
Yeah.
People who commit murder have done it as a selfish, it's just a selfish act. It's whether it was for monetary purposes, because of anger over whatever it was. It's a selfish act. And there's people who I talk to who have been convicted of that crime, who say they're innocent, And it's all about them. It's them. I'm innocent. I'll prove my innocence. I'll show them when I get out of here, blah, 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 and it's very intense in that. The people who say they're innocent, who I find more genuine, they ask me about myself. There's a guy called Tariq Makbul who I've spoken to, and this is actually in his episode I talked about this because, every message he would send me would ask me about my family. And, my father was very sick when we were talking, and he would ask me about how my father's going, and just a lot of empathy there. And when you spoke to them on the phone, very quietly spoken, very empathetic, very, there was empathy there.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, that's one little tell I think I've got.
Did you get any of those tells with Marcellus?
He did. He sent me one of his messages asking me about, because again, my father was sick. My father was sick for a long time, so I'm saying my father was sick. And I do try and build a rapport with these men and women who I speak to, and I'm very comfortable talking about my personal life with them because I'm asking them to share with me their life. So I share myself as well. And he did ask about my father. He said my father would be in his prayers because he's a very religious man. He'd become a Muslim while in prison. So there was that, and he was a nice, softly spoken man. And again, doesn't mean much, because I'm sure there's serial killers out there who are softly spoken people. But yeah, I just got a sense of not an angry man, which you would expect someone to be, I suppose.
If they're preparing to die, yeah.
Yeah, and not in that. There's people I speak to who have been wrongfully incarcerated that I know, I truly believe are wrongfully incarcerated because if you look at their case and it's a no-brainer. And they're not as angry as they should be, in my opinion. Like there's a gentleman, Evaristo Salas Jr., who actually we may have spoken about.
We did.
Previously. And he's been exonerated now. And he was the same, just so empathetic, so calm, thoughtful. Like he was looking at it, in a very philosophical way. And you're like, how are you doing this? Whereas there's other people who are just angry and they're just like, I will prove my innocence, and just like, oh, wow, okay. So yeah, I did feel that with Marcellus, that sort of, gentle, sort of thoughtful, philosophical side of it. Let's
go back to the start. What kind of upbringing did Marcellus have?
So he grows up in Missouri, in St. Louis. He's the third of 4 boys. He grew up in his grandparents' home with his mother. No father figure in his life, apart from his grandfather, who said, was a hard worker and was working to take care of the family, but no real sort of solid, like his father wasn't in his life. He sort of says his childhood was happy. I mean, they were poor, but he said they never went without food or anything like that. So from a young age, there was, apart from having no father, he said the family was close, tight-knit family. There was no, from what he told me, there's no abuse or anything like that, just poverty, really. He said it was when he got to his teens that he started going a little bit wayward, as a lot of people do, I suppose, when you're a teenager and you want to test the boundaries and all that sort of stuff. And he said, he started seeing people with things, nice clothes and that sort of stuff, and started wanting for those things. And he essentially started just going the wrong way about obtaining those nice things. And that came in the form of burglaries and bits and pieces. And in fact, he found himself incarcerated for the first time in 1988 at the age of 18.
Yeah, wow. Because he had about 16 convictions prior to being arrested for the murder.
Yeah, he was in and out. So he goes in 1988. I believe he did about a year on that one and was out in the end of 89. And that one was so when they say, 16 charges, there's probably multiple charges because the first time he goes in, there was a motor vehicle, burglary charge and assault on a police officer.
Which is probably wrapped up to one conviction.
Yeah. He had multiple charges in that. And then when he came out, he says he got a job and he started actually going to a trade school. He had a partner and then his first child came along at that stage. So he was trying to work to be better and to not go down that route. But he said eventually the pool of the criminality just, again, easy money as opposed to, what he was trying to do to get ahead with his family. And he ends up basically back in prison. I think it was January of 1990. So he wasn't out for very long and then he was back in again. And that was for a 7-year stretch. So again, multitude of charges involved in that one as well. And then he comes out of prison and then again, he's not out for very long at all. And he was back into prison in 1998 and then he was never released again.
So the body of Felecia Gayle was found stabbed in her apartment in the August of 1998. Firstly, what do we know about her?
So was a newspaper reporter, but a social worker as well. she was married, essentially, a lovely person, did no wrong, she was just an all-round lovely person, and that's, I think, they lived her and her husband lived in a reasonably affluent part of town, and this is why, again, it caused so much uproar, because not only was this a murder, but it was quite a brutal murder. I mean, I think she was stabbed over 40 times, maybe 42 times she was stabbed. So, of course, I mean, the community was just in uproar about that situation, how this lady can be just at home. She was reportedly in the shower, had got out of the shower, and that's when she was brutally stabbed. I mean, 42 times is obviously
horrific.
Yeah, it's insanity.
You're listening to True Crime Conversations with me, Gemma Barth. I'm speaking with journalist Jack Laurence about the execution of Marcellus Williams. Up next, we talk about the evidence that was left at the crime scene and how it was used to convict Williams of murder. Do we know anything about the crime scene, whether there was any evidence?
Well, this is the thing, and this is why this case has been so, I suppose, it's caused so much attention, because of the amount of evidence that was at that crime scene that didn't match Marcellus Williams.
Mm-hmm.
So we'll start. There was hair found, for instance, to start with. So there was hair found near Felicia at the time. I think some may have been on her or nearby her. It was found. It was tested. Did not match Marcellus Williams, nor did it match her. So the question mark became, well, whose hair is that? There was apparently a plethora of fingerprints, bloody fingerprints. But apparently I've heard different stories as opposed to what was the issue with these fingerprints, but there was some that stated that basically the prints weren't of a good enough quality, any of them, to actually come up with a match for anyone, let alone Marcellus Williams. And then I heard that somewhere along the line that they may have even just disappeared. They've been thrown out, the evidence that was gathered there. Then you've got a bloody footprint that was pointing in the direction of leaving the scene of the crime, which was, again, tested against Marcellus for the size, obviously. They could get a good idea of the size of the footprint. And it was too small to be Marcellus's foot. So, again, the question is, well, who's made that bloody footprint, But the biggest one, of course, is the knife. The knife that killed Felicia was left still in her. She had the knife still in her when they found her. And that was obviously the biggest piece of evidence. But the weird thing was that was never tested for DNA or anything at the time. For some reason, that was just never tested. And it wasn't until later down the track that knife would actually be tested. And that was the biggest conjecture about this whole case, because initially it comes back that Marcellus has been excluded from that knife. Like, his DNA is just not on there. But then there was DNA found on that. And the biggest thing that came out was it belonged to one of the prosecutors in the case. And then he eventually, actually, at an evidentiary hearing that was had not that long ago, he admitted to mishandling the murder weapon, handling it without gloves, basically. And he wasn't the only one. Multiple people had done it. So, in fact, they destroyed any chance of ever working out whether Marcellus's DNA was on that knife or not. And the prosecutor's office, openly put their hands up and said, what, this is completely, we've messed up here. This is, blah, blah, blah. And they'd actually made a deal with Marcellus's defense team to commute his sentence from death to life in prison. Marcellus wasn't going to admit to have committed this crime, but they said, look, we will agree to commute this down to a life sentence and take away the death penalty. He agreed to that because obviously you can't fight your case if you're dead. Mm-hmm. So he agreed to that, hoping that they could continue the fight and eventually something will come out that will fully exonerate him. It was like the best of a bad situation, really. But unfortunately, the Attorney General of Missouri got involved and fought that, and the High Court came back and reinstated the death penalty.
I want to get to that series of events in more detail soon. But firstly, if we go back to the start, were there any other suspects that we know of apart from Marcellus?
No, it's one of those situations that they didn't have any lead. There was actually a similar burglary that had happened not that long prior to that, but they had no one for that either. Very similar MO, but they had no leads on anyone. And it was only until the old classic prison snitch comes along that they finally had a suspect. And this is the issue that I find in so many cases that I deal with, is that police having no leads, especially in their cases where you hear this a lot, or they were under a lot of pressure to get this one solved. They're under a lot of pressure. And when the cops are under a lot of pressure, what do they want to do? Quickly solve this case so they've got no more pressure. So if someone comes along to them and says, yeah, this is the guy who did it, okay, tell us more. They had so little to go on with this case, or had no one, that the partner of Felicia, her husband at the time, offered up a reward of $10,000 for information that would lead to an arrest. And it wasn't until that reward was announced that, hey, amazingly, all of a sudden, this guy has had a full confession from Marcellus Williams as to him committing this crime. And apparently it was an in-prison confession. Marcellus was in prison with this guy who Marcellus told me was actually a distant relative of his, and he didn't realize. And they ended up being incarcerated together. And literally, as this guy's released, he goes straight to the place that says, oh, yeah, I know who did this. He told me about it. He admitted to it. And not only that, one of Marcellus's former partners, she also basically joined forces with this guy who was in prison and said, yeah, Marcellus definitely did this. She said, I saw him with this purse. Then we've got this laptop issue that we can talk about, because there were items belonging to Felecia Gayle that were found in Marcellus's grandfather's car.
Which is a strange link to get to. So has Marcellus admitted to anything in this case? Did he steal from Felicia?
No. So, because this is the thing people come back to, is like the biggest argument is like, well, if he had nothing to do with it, how on earth has he got her stuff?
Mm.
And I was the same. I'm like, well, yeah. I mean, as soon as I heard that, I'm like, oh, okay, this isn't good. Because you've got stuff. In fact, he even sells the laptop that belonged to Felicia's husband to a guy for drugs or something. I don't know if I think it was drugs that he was sort of swapping it for. So I'm like, well, okay, well, this doesn't look good. But once you dig into that further, more question marks come up. So you find out that his former partner was working as a sex worker, and she was sleeping in his grandfather's vehicle. She was also using that vehicle to conduct her business. And Marcellus admitted, that he did take this laptop to this guy, and they had actually the guy who took the laptop from Marcellus on the stand to testify, yes, Marcellus Williams did sell me this laptop. He was going to also say that what Marcellus brought the laptop and said that he got it from his girlfriend. She'd given it to him and said, here, take this and go and sell it for drugs or whatever. But the guy who got the laptop was not allowed to testify to that part of it. He was only allowed to testify to the fact that Marcellus had sold him the laptop or swapped it with him for drugs.
Which sounds bizarre, because isn't that an important detail?
That they call is hearsay. They say it's a hearsay. So hearsay is, him saying, well, Marcellus told me that he got it from his girlfriend. That's hearsay. He didn't see Marcellus get it from his girlfriend. He got no way of knowing if Marcellus actually did get it from his girlfriend. That's just what Marcellus told him. So the judge said it's hearsay. It's not allowed in. But for me, I agree. It's a very important factor of that case, because there is a theory, and I put that out, it's just a theory, but there is a theory that, if it wasn't Marcellus who committed this crime, the theory is that it could have in fact been a quote-unquote client of his former partner who committed the robbery and had exchanged what he got from the robbery with her for her services. She's then gone to Marcellus and said, hey, look, I've got this laptop, take that, sell it, whatever. That's how he has possession of the items. Now, people say, oh, that's a bit of a stretch. It's like, okay, but it's not impossible.
And if we look at what Marcellus was charged over, it was those links, right? So he's actually charged with murder based on these items that were found in this car.
Yeah, and the testimony of the girlfriend or the former girlfriend and this guy from prison who stood to get $10,000 for their testimony. And there was also evidence to show that his former girlfriend and the guy who were in prison had multiple phone calls back and forth while he was in prison before he left. Why are they talking and what are they talking about is the question. And not only that, on top of that, you have other people from both those people's lives who've made statements. So you've got the son of the guy who said that Marcellus admitted to him. He's come forward and made a statement saying that his dad had mentioned that he was going to be coming into some money because of a caper that he was running. And then the girlfriend or the former girlfriend, some of her friends had come forward and said that she'd openly even admitted to the fact she was setting him up to get the cash. So there's a big thing. All these people are like, it's so funny because I've seen obviously some people who staunch the fact that Marcellus was 100% guilty, deserve what he got. And, they come up and say, well, how has he got his stuff? And how did this guy, know details about what had happened? And I said, well, there's all these, things that I can give you to say, well, this is how it could have happened. And they go, oh, whatever. Yeah, sure. Like, I mean, oh, yeah, right, that could have happened. It's like, but it could have. It really could have. So what I'm saying is what I've always said the whole way through is like, I'm not saying that he's 100% innocent. What I'm saying is there's far too many question marks around this case to make it that final where we're going to say we're going to kill someone.
Especially when, we were just talking about hearsay, but here we are believing the testimony of two people, but we're not allowed to believe the testimony of anyone else in those people's lives.
And what's amazing with that, you find as well in these cases, especially with these whole snitch cases where there's people from prison who come up and give the cops essentially what they need for a conviction. And I've seen it happen in the past, happened in the Evaristo Salas Jr. case. A snitch in that case was the reason that he got arrested. And eventually that snitch recanted. And then what they say is once someone recants, they go, well, you can't trust that person. He's a criminal. It's like, well, hold on a second. And that's literally what they said in the Evaristo Salas Jr. case. They said, well, you can't trust him. He's a criminal. It's like, well, hold on a second. We were trusting him before. When
you used that evidence.
Yes. That was your evidence to get him convicted in the first place. But now it's not, what you want to hear. Oh, we can't trust that person. So, and this snitch thing is just, it's so rife, and it still is in the US. So they stood to gain from Marcellus being found guilty. Again, $10,000. And it was funny because that guy even got more help because Marcellus, when he was finally charged with this, he wanted a speedy trial. And, you have the right in America to a speedy trial. So he said, I want a speedy trial. And his lawyer, he said, was actually trying to talk him out of pushing for a speedy trial. And he's like, I don't understand why he was doing that. And he said, I regret. He ended up going with the attorney and saying, okay, all right, well, we won't push for that. Because I think the attorney was like, we need time to build a better defense. Whereas he later found out that the prosecution that had lost their key witness, the guy, he just disappeared on them. Like they'd given him some money and he'd gone off somewhere to blow the money and, whatever he was doing with it. So they needed the time to get him back because otherwise he wouldn't have been back in time to give the evidence.
How did the trial go? Because that was in 2001.
Yeah, so I mean, the biggest thing about the trial was, I believe it's very quick, but the other issue was surrounding the jury. So, jury of your peers, it was not. There was 11 white people and one black person. And this was another issue that was brought forward, in fact, by the prosecutor's office, because it was, in fact, the prosecutor's office that was pushing to have Marcellus's sentence downgraded. Not the old prosecution, this new. So there's a Wesley Bell, who's the new prosecutor of St. Louis. And he's the one that said there's issues with this case. There's a lot of issues with this case. And one of those issues they had was with this jury selection and how 4 African Americans were removed from that jury. And essentially they believed wrongly removed from the jury. And they believed it was a race related removal. I mean, there's not much else you can say that it is if you're just taking 4 people off the jury and they're all African Americans.
And it's a case involving a person that is black.
African American, exactly. And it's just like, 11 to 1. You got 11, white people and 1 black person. When it comes time for deliberation, I mean, it's not going to take much for all those people to gang up on one person and say he's guilty, and then they cave unless they're the most solid human being on earth. So trial-wise, that was essentially one of the biggest issues from trial was this jury selection and how that was handled. And one of those things that was brought up, but that was later dismissed in an evidentiary hearing. I think the prosecutor came forward and said, it wasn't a race thing, and this is the reason I did it. And the judge was fine with that and said, okay, yeah, that's reasonable.
So as we know, Marcellus was given the death penalty as a result of that trial and of his conviction. He was first scheduled for execution in 2015 and then again in 2017. Why didn't they go ahead? What happened?
He was lucky enough to get a stay of execution. Well, one of the times, I think the second time, he was literally, I think, an hour away from the chair.
Can you imagine?
And the governor, I believe, at the time stepped in. The governor of the state has the power to step in and say no. The latest governor did not step in, obviously. But this previous governor looked at it and said, I think we need to look at this more. So it's just about who's in power at the time, really. That's all it comes down to. And what amazes me the most is that the only reason, really, that this ever made it back into some sort of evidentiary hearing was because of the office that put him there in the first place. You got the prosecutor's office going, guys, this doesn't look right. And in recent times, they've in fact exonerated like three people, one of which I've spoken to while he was still in prison, Christopher Dunn. And it's all off the back of this prosecutor who's brilliant, Wesley Bell. You know, he's doing what a lot of prosecutors don't do, and actually looking at these cases properly and saying, no, there is an issue here. And he's going in fighting for these people. And the thing is, he's coming forward and saying, you know, this is wrong. I think this needs to be overturned. And half the time, he's the only option that they've got, because if they've exhausted all their appeals, they've got nothing left. And the prosecutor has the power to say, no, this needs to go back in front of a judge to be looked at. And he did it again. He did it this time. He said, this needs to go back to court to be looked at. I mean, he initially recommended that the Marcellus be exonerated completely. And then when the DNA came back and they couldn't actually fully exclude Marcellus because it just, you know, they'd mishandled it and there was just no way of even telling if his DNA was on there at all. That's when he said, well, look, this is what we agreed to. Even the Felicia's family agreed to that. They signed off on that. They said, yeah, absolutely. They did not want the death penalty. They even said to, because it's only the attorney general wanted this death penalty to go ahead. He fights tooth and nail for anyone that's, I mean, Christopher Dunn, who got exonerated, you know, the judge literally brought the hammer down and said, release that man immediately. And then the attorney general rings the prison and says, do not let him out.
Why? Why is he so steadfast on putting people to death?
I mean, honestly, I've looked at this. He's done it time and time and time and time and time again. Every single person who the prosecutor's office have come forward and said, this is a wrongful conviction, he is there to fight it. He's in fact in court. His team is fighting the prosecutor's office.
Which is wild because, like, we should point out again, the prosecution are the people that put you in prison. Yes. And it's the prosecution coming out and saying, uh-oh, we made a mistake. Mm-hmm. Like, that's wild.
Isn't it? It's crazy. That's what blows my... And I say this all the time. I'm like, I do not understand it. When your office, who is in charge of putting people behind bars, is coming out and saying this is wrong, you're still fighting it. And you're going, no. And they're in court, literally. You've got the Attorney General's office in court saying that person is guilty. You've got the prosecutor standing there going, that man is innocent. And
on the opposite side.
Yes. It's not even the defense's team. You know, they're in there as well fighting, but it just blows my mind. If anyone wants to see it, like Christopher Dunn is a perfect case to look at. There's another case with Missouri, and you just look at the prosecutors up there fighting back and forth with the Attorney General's office. They're supposed to be on the same side. They are on the same side. They put bad people in prison.
So in Marcellus's case, we've got the prosecution saying he shouldn't be put to death. We've got the victim's family saying that as well. And I believe the jury?
Yeah. Everybody except the Attorney General.
For many years too.
No one wanted the death penalty.
Because it looks like, as far as I can see, this kind of wheels in motion with the Board of Inquiry and everything kind of happened after the second stay of execution, so after 2017. So this has been a fight they've been fighting for many years.
Yeah, but the other thing is that one of the governors put together this Board of Inquiry, but no results were ever released for it.
Why was that?
No one knows. No one knows. No results. They put together this whole team that was supposed to look into this case, and all of a sudden they just went, nah, and just closed the case, and just like no results were ever released. Nothing. Just nothing.
But they did have an evidentiary hearing quite recently. And a lot of that damning kind of evidence that you mentioned about the knife and the mishandling and the jury about the black African-American jurors being discarded from the jury, all of that kind of stuff was revisited, right?
Yeah, I mean, but again, the judge didn't see an issue with the jury situation. You know, someone got up and explained reasoning behind, I can't remember, there was some bizarre reason behind post offices or something. It was very odd. I didn't really understand it, but essentially the judge was fine with that, and that was struck off.
What about the knife?
The knife, again, but that's the thing. It's like, hold on, you guys have messed up, okay? So whether his DNA is on that knife or not, we'll never know because you messed up. That's on you. Okay. So, and the other thing is, like, no one's saying, let this man leave and skip off into the sunset.
No.
We're just saying, hey, let's just not kill him just in case. Because if 5, 10, 15, 20 years down the track, some more evidence comes out to show, oh, actually, no, he's innocent. If he's dead, well, I guarantee you some official will come out and go, yeah, we really regret that and we do apologize, and that'll be it. And we'll move on with our lives, you know. But if he was still alive, we can write, he's been in prison obviously for that many years, so that's terrible, but at least he can finally get out. But obviously we're in this situation now where that's not possible. And this is my biggest frustration. I don't understand. The law in America is very confusing.
And in this instance, we're talking about an attorney general that basically was like, no, death penalty stands. But what about the Supreme Court? What about the people higher up? Couldn't they intervene?
Well, they can, but they didn't. It's like the governor again. He could have intervened. He could have stopped the whole thing, but he chose not to. There was over 1 million signatures for people not wanting this to happen. Marcellus Williams had more support than I've seen since I've been doing this. I haven't been doing this that long, but he had an amazing, insane amount of support from around the world and millions of signatures. There was even news footage of people lined up outside the office of the governor with signatures, like piles and piles of signatures, bringing them in. But the biggest issue I think with this situation is that these people in power, like your Attorney General, Andrew Bailey, who loves the death penalty and putting people in prison, like the judges, like, your governors, prosecutors, well, not prosecutor in this case, he's brilliant, but most prosecutors, they are elected positions.
Mm-hmm.
So they're elected by the people.
Which is bizarre.
It is bizarre because they're politicians. They're not. And at the end of the day, as I always say, their biggest catch cry is tough on crime because we all want our streets to be safe. We all want to be able to walk down the street at night and not have to worry about, being murdered. So when someone comes out and says, we've put away X amount of bad people, look how good we are, the public go, oh, yeah, fantastic, yay. And there's been research done around election time and the rates of incarceration go up. Incarceration rates and lengths of sentences go up. Judges are far harsher on their sentencing because, again, they're elected officials. And come election time, they want to yell, look at me, look at my numbers, look how many bad people I'm putting away in prison. I think where it went really wrong for Marcellus when it came to wanting, someone like the governor to get involved was I think there was too much support for him. And that sounds weird, but what I mean by that is like it got to a point where I think the governor didn't want to show that he might bend to public pressure and that he was staunch and that he's like, no, I'm going to, I believe this man's guilty and we will continue on. But I go back to the fact the family did not want this. So this is supposed to be for the victims.
Justice for the victims.
Justice for the victims. But if the victims don't want this, then what are we doing it for? I think they wrote a letter to police saying, please do not kill this man in our name. We don't want that. But they did it anyway. And in the statement, the governor said, I hope this, can put a line under the sand and now the victim's family can move on. It's like,
I don't usually get this riled up on an episode of True Crime Conversations, but
oh, mate, this is my life. It's so frustrating.
Like you say, we're not saying free the guy, but it's so hard to look at this case when you're like, there's supposed to be no reasonable doubt. And it is very obvious to me and to you, in this case, there is reasonable doubt. Yeah. There just is.
Absolutely there is. And that's the thing. I found myself stupidly, and I shouldn't, but arguing with people online. Because I'm just like because everyone's like, it's like he made his bed, he lies in it, it's like, but hold on a second. Again, we're not saying let him skip off into the sunset and have a wonderful life. We're saying, hey, let's just not kill him. This is why I don't understand. Why, as we said, there is reasonable doubt. Whether you believe, whether you say, oh, that would never happen, but it could have. And that is what we call reasonable doubt. It could have happened. It's not so far-fetched that laptop could have been given to Marcellus's former partner as a form of payment for the work she was doing, because we know for a fact she was living in his car. We know for a fact she was working out of his car. We know for a fact, because the guy who took the laptop from Marcellus said, and you could say, well, he could be wrong, or, Marcellus could have been lying. Yes, but he may not have been as well. She gave him that laptop and said, exchange it for drugs. I don't know. It just blows my mind that they're so willing to just draw a line under the sand and make it that final when there is still reasonable doubt.
Something else that isn't in Marcellus's corner, I've read kind of two sides of the coin when it comes to the kind of prisoner he was over his many years in prison. On the one hand, you hear all of this information about him, leading prayer and converting to Islam and being this softly spoken man. But on the other hand, he's also been disciplined over 100 times while in prison, verbal and physical alterations with inmates and guards. And so I can see how the public would get an idea in their head. But once again, that doesn't make him a murderer.
No, absolutely.
Necessarily.
Absolutely not. So there's a lot of people I speak to who, prison is a dangerous place to be. Again, going back to Evaristo Salas Jr., I mean, he joined a prison gang. He joined a Hispanic prison gang when he went to prison. He definitely didn't kill anyone. He's been exonerated. But he did what he had to do to survive in those places. They are not nice places to live, As I said at the very start of this, some of the people I speak to can very rarely get a phone because it's controlled by gangs. And if you don't fight, you become a victim because they are just ruthless places to be. So the fact that Marcellus had, against officers, that's not, but then again, the officers in these places sometimes aren't very nice human beings either, So, when you hear this person had infractions in prison for fighting and that sort of stuff, to me, it's like, you do what you got to do in those places. I've spoken to so many people who were just normal people when they went into prison, and then they went into prison and they completely changed because of the environment that they're placed into. And you can very quickly become a target for extortion, sexual abuse, all those sorts of things. I speaking to a guy at the moment who's been in prison since 1985, and we've spoken about, that. I said, how do you stay out of trouble? He said, well, you've got to stand up for yourself. You got to show that you will not be pushed around. Otherwise, it ain't a nice time for you.
How does the process of execution go in that state? We've talked about the fact that he had the freedom of a phone. What else was he given in the months and days, and what do those final days and hours look like?
Yeah, I've actually recently had a man explain this to me. It was quite sobering again. The guy who's been in prison since 1985, he was originally on death row. In fact, he was on death row with Ted Bundy.
Oh, wow.
And saw Ted Bundy being taken to the chair. It was an electric chair back in those days, but now it's slightly more humane. But once you're given your date, you are moved from, in Missouri, actually, if you're on death row, you're not on what they call the row. You're actually in general population, which is unusual. Generally, for people who are put on death row, they are placed on what they call the row, and they have less time outside of their cells, and any movement they make is completely shackled. 2 guards, arms, feet, everything shackled wherever you go, and all the rest of it. So, once you've been given your date, you are then moved to this other section of the prison where everything you need is in your cell. You have a shower, toilet, you've got TV, bed. Everything basically is done within the cell, because essentially they want to keep an eye on you. And this gentleman told me actually in the sort of last week, I think it's the last full week before you're executed, you in fact have a guard sit outside your cell. So you have literally no privacy whatsoever. You're in a cell that's fully just bars, there's no doors or anything like that. And the reason for the guard sitting there is to make sure that you don't kill yourself. How ridiculous is that? They don't want you to kill yourself.
They want to do it.
They want to make sure they're doing it. So they sit and watch you for a week. And then what they call a white hat comes to get you, or what this gentleman told me. He's talking about Florida, but so Missouri might be slightly different. But he talked me through the process of Florida. He said a white hat comes to get you, which is a captain. He said that they attach you to what they affectionately call a dog pole. It's apparently a long pole, and they've got a couple of them because obviously they're walking you to your death. So you may decide that, well, I've got nothing left to lose. I may as well see, how many officers I can take out on the way. And he said with these poles, they're set up so that if you do try and resist, they basically twist them, and it sort of cuts through your wrists and stuff. It's very brutal. And you're led to the chamber in Missouri. I've seen a photo of the room that they're in. It's very clinical, very stale sort of looking room with a bed with straps on it. You're placed obviously onto the bed. You're strapped in. There's a phone on the wall, and that phone is for it's either for the Attorney General or for the governor. But essentially that's the phone call that either says, yep, all good, or no, we're taking back sort of thing. Phone rings. Yep, go ahead with it. And you're asked any final words. And in the state of Missouri, as I said, it's an injection, 2 injections, I believe. Marcellus would have had a white sheet pulled over him up to his neck, so only his face is showing. And yeah, that's it, basically. Says his last words, and you have the gallery obviously watching on.
His son watching on.
Yeah, his son said he was always going to be there with him.
You kind of joined the fight to try and get him off death row towards the end there. You were kind of calling out to your listeners as well. How did you feel when that death date did actually come?
It was very weird. Like, as I said, I didn't build the sort of relationship with him that I have with a number of other people I've spoken to. There's some people I've been speaking with for nearly 3 years. We speak quite regularly, so I've got quite a strong relationship with a number of people who are incarcerated. But for him, it was a much shorter period of time, and I did feel strongly about not wanting him to be killed. So I was, rallying people to try and sign these petitions and stuff like that. And then I was sitting watching. There was a vigil happening outside the prison where it was being taken place, and I was watching that. And everyone's sort of obviously hoping for that last stay. You sit there waiting and waiting and waiting, and then eventually someone says, oh, the witnesses are now coming out, which means it's happened. And then the statement gets put out that it's, it happened. It's very weird. Very weird. Especially I put together a little thing, a little package from him and I's interview. And that was weird, listening to the conversation, knowing that he was no longer around and he passed just literally an hour prior. And, there's a little bit at the end of our chat, he said, I said, thanks so much indeed. It was really lovely to chat with you, and we'll speak soon. And he just said, God willing, lovely to talk to you too. Nice meeting you.
Nice meeting you, Jack. Nice meeting you.
You too, sir, and I will talk to you very soon.
All right. God willing. Take care.
Okay. Bye-bye. And, it was just weird, I'm not going to sit here and say I was bawling my eyes out, because I didn't know the man, but I did feel... I felt a little bit guilty, I suppose, in a way. I feel guilty about talking to with a lot of the stories I talk about, because I feel like I don't want to, I'm talking to these people, and I always say to them, look, I don't want to give you any false hope that being on here is going to do anything to help your situation. So I suppose there was a little bit of guilt that nothing I did really helped him at all. So yeah, it's a weird one, very weird.
Did he tell you how he felt about death?
Well, his religion basically was, because I said to him, obviously we've talked about his stays and how he had multiple stays. And I said, that's got to really mess with you mentally. You've had multiple stays of execution, and now you've got this other one coming up. And, we all know that we're going to die, but the thing is we don't know when. Whereas this is, you've got this date. This is when you're going to die, at the time you're going to die. So that must really... you must, mentally it must be hard. And he's like, well, yeah, like as I'm normal like everybody else. I have anxieties and things like that, but I've put my faith in my faith, and if this is what's to happen, then this is what's to happen. So and you'll find there's a lot. There's that big sort of running joke about people who become religious in prison. Everyone sort of laughs or sort of says, oh yeah, here we go, there's another one who's converted. But when you're at your darkest moment, you need something. You need some, especially for people who've been wrongfully convicted. There needs to be you need to feel like there's a reason why.
There's obviously been a lot of outrage. This has been getting a lot of media headlines. Probably not as many as you would expect down under.
Yeah, well, I've got one article in news.com, I think, once he'd been killed. But even in the own country. But that's how fickle our news cycle is, though, isn't it? Because, it was huge for a couple of days, and then we move on. Something else is, Donald Trump said something stupid, or, and we move on. Someone actually asked me the other day, I was doing a Q&A on my show, and they said, do you know if anyone's going after the state or anyone for going ahead with the execution? And I said, I thought about this myself. I wonder if people are still going to try and prove his innocence. Obviously he's got family. And I'm sure they would love to keep doing that, but you can't do that without legal help. And you just wonder whether or not the Innocence Project, they've got so much work on, they're probably like, can't do much now.
Still trying to save people.
And you wonder if anyone ever will try and fully clear his name.
Why? Why are these cases not getting more attention or more prolonged attention?
People don't care. But if I think about it, before I got into what I do now, I didn't give people in prison a second thought. I didn't think about people in prison. I was of the opinion if you're in prison, you did something wrong, you deserve to be there. It's only now that I'm engrossed in it all the time and I'm seeing these things. 135 people already this year have been exonerated, of 20 years, 30 years. Christopher Dunn, 35, I think 33, 34 years, something like that. But it just gets no attention, or it might be in the news that night and then they move on. And these people aren't even eligible for compensation most of the time either. And that blows my mind, they have to fight for that.
But then there's stories like the Menendez brothers, and they've been in the headlines for months now.
Netflix effect, isn't it?
True.
Yeah, if you get a documentary made, you're probably going to get more attention.
So do you think this will have any effect on Missouri, that they'll change, they'll want to change, they'll be affected by all the bad press?
No. The governor, if you look at the governor's Instagram or Facebook page after this happened, I don't know why he didn't turn comments off, because it was just insane. So I don't know whether or not he might get reelected, or who knows, he may not get reelected the next time round. The Andrew Bailey, the Attorney General, he's still going about his business. Speaking of Christopher Dunn, I spoke to Christopher yesterday, who's now out of prison, but I said to him, how's things going? He goes, oh, well, the Attorney General's appealing to get me put back in prison. And he's been exonerated. It's like, dude, move on. So no, I don't think it'll change anything at all. I always say to my American audience, like, I don't mean to attack your country, because no one's got it right. Everyone's got I think we've all got terrible legal systems, but I think when it's so ingrained in a society, like their gun situation, that's never going to change.
No.
They're too far gone, and America has the highest incarceration rate in the world. Like 2 million people incarcerated.
But the Australian justice system, we should give it props in comparison here, because one, we don't have the death penalty, which, I don't believe in. I can see that you don't believe in the death penalty. But two, we don't elect our attorney generals. They get there on merit. So, there's two positives in our corner. We hopefully don't see as many cases of people wrongfully convicted, I would hope.
Norway and those countries, they've got phenomenal, they're closing prisons. You want to look at a country that's doing it right. They're closing prisons because their recidivism rate is dropping dramatically. But then again, we don't have it. I think we're the other way. I think we're too soft in some respects, because people always say to me, oh, what do you want? Just no prisons and la-di-da? No. I think there's a lot of people that should be in prison. In fact, a lot of them live around my area. But, I don't think anywhere's got it right. I just think, America is just insane. They hand out years like it's days, as one of my prisoners I spoke to once said to me. He goes, they hand out years like it's days. Guy going to be talking to very soon has got 1,200-year sentence.
1,200 years?
Yeah, it's crazy. I've got another guy who's got life plus 103, just in case, reincarnation and all that sort of stuff.
I guess it just really makes you question the justice system. And I know that we're in Australia, so, if we were to be convicted of a crime, it would be in Australia. But it really does make you question in 2024 how things like this can still happen.
And that's what I say all the time. Like, how is this still happening in 2024? But again, going back to the sheer volume of people who are incarcerated in America just means that the courts are just so overwhelmed that half the time they're not even reading the cases. They're just rubber stamping, people putting through appeals. So they're just getting rubber stamped. I've got an attorney who joins me on the show every time we cover a case to give his opinion. So I'm not being completely biased. And, he comes with a clear head and says, well, hold on a second, let's look at this. But even he says, some cases he just shakes his head and he just goes, and I say, I don't understand, Michael, how is someone not higher up in power looking at this and going, oh, actually, there's some issues here, because you're telling me there's issues here. You're telling me there's great arguments for this person to be released. He said, because they're just not reading it. They get a top page, which is generally from the prosecutor, why this person was convicted, and they go, oh, yeah, sounds plausible, boom, stamp, denied, and away we go.
Thanks to Jack for helping us to tell this story. True Crime Conversations is a Mamamia podcast hosted and produced by me, Gemma Barth, and Tahli Blackman, with audio design by Thom. Thanks so much for listening. I'll be back next week with another True Crime Conversation.